Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unconfirmed, the podcast that reveals how the marquee names in crypto are reacting to the week's top headlines and gets the inside scoop on what they see on the horizon. I'm your host, Laura Shin. If you aren't receiving my weekly email newsletter, go to unchainedpodcast.com to sign up. And don't forget that Unchained and Unconfirmed are now on YouTube. You can go subscribe there to be alerted to all the latest episodes of both podcasts.
CipherTrace cutting-edge cryptocurrency intelligence powers anti-money laundering, blockchain analytics, and threat intel. Leading exchanges, virtual currency businesses, banks, and regulators themselves use CipherTrace to comply with regulation and to monitor compliance.
Today's guest is Nick Carter, partner at Castle Island Ventures. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me on.
You wrote a really interesting piece on Medium recently, and I wanted to discuss it. You talked about how cryptocurrency threatens the state. So what are the ways in which it does that?
Well, it may not be threatening the state right now, but the point I was trying to make in the article was that that is sort of the whole idea, that the cryptocurrency is manifestly political by its very nature. And we shouldn't, try and ignore that reality. Instead, we should essentially embrace it and prepare for the battles to come, basically. And so the article was a call to arms, so to speak. And I mean, ultimately, I think the main way that cryptocurrency will likely affect states is by making it much harder to impose capital controls as a tool of monetary policy. And we already have some examples of that. There's sort of some early anecdotal evidence, maybe, that the popularity of Tether has to do with Chinese folks trying to escape the capital controls. We know that there are Bitcoin markets down in Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, all these places where inflation is pretty high. So, it's still relatively immature, and a lot of tools are required to make it easier to onboard people, especially in these more frontier markets into cryptocurrency. But I think it's already beginning to affect the state. And certainly central banks have started to wonder a little bit about whether cryptocurrency is going to destabilize kind of the current monetary regime.
And when you say that cryptocurrency is political in its inherently in its nature, why do you say that?
So I mean that in two ways. So the first is that, just to take Bitcoin, for instance, Bitcoin is impregnated with kind of political ideas. And many people would contend that that's a bad thing, because maybe that makes it more exclusionary, or it requires that you have certain beliefs before using it. But I don't really mean it in that way. I just mean to say that there are certain values that very much underscore Bitcoin and kind of motivated its creation. And Satoshi kind of hinted at those in a few places. So those would be values like, creating new units of money should be kind of costly, and nobody should have an unfair advantage in doing that. So there shouldn't be any seigniorage. And the supply of money should be really predictable, and there should be no kind of monetary discretion in the system. I think both of those are sort of political concepts, and they point to a really definite alternative to the current system that predominates. And then the other way I would say cryptocurrency is political is that these are institutions, and as long as there are decisions being made, there are decision makers, and there is power, and the hated G word, there's governance as well. And so that is a reality that I think many of the people that lead and design cryptocurrencies and public blockchains would prefer to ignore. And they like to claim that these systems are fully decentralized, and that there are no one really has any privileged status within them. But basically in the article, I'm saying that's not the case. There is always power, there's always decision makers, and oftentimes the debates are really political. And I mean, we should probably seek to minimize that, but we should definitely acknowledge it as a reality.
You also say in your piece that Bitcoin has already affected central bank policy. How so? Which central banks?
That might have been maybe a slightly utopian or ambitious thing to say, but yeah, one thing I say is that the currency competition is like outrunning a bear. You only have to outrun your slowest friend. So the dollar is probably the soundest sovereign currency, and so I would say it's the least threatened by the existence of cryptocurrency. But so the ones that are the most affected by cryptocurrency, even in its very incipient state, are, it kind of logically follows that they are the ones which are the most inflationary, that the citizens want to hold the least. And now that we have this online exit ramp from sovereign currencies, which is relatively frictionless, people have a choice of where to save their assets. And so we absolutely there is some data showing that Venezuelans had fairly vibrant, peer-to-peer Bitcoin to Bolivar markets. For sure, they might actually have preferred dollars in that case, but there's definitely been some usage of Bitcoin down there.
Yeah, and
so I would say,
I will say I spoke with local Bitcoins. I think this was on Unconfirmed, and they said the behavior they were seeing was that people were converting their bolivars to USD, but using Bitcoin to do so. And then again, using Bitcoin as a way to convert it back when they needed the bolivars. So,
right.
So, yeah.
So with Bitcoin being actually the dollarization rails, which is pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading through some monetary history to find out how other dollarization events had mechanically occurred. And I found out that the Zimbabwe dollarization was a little bit impaired because there was a shortage of actual physical dollars, because it was really difficult to get, hard currency into the country, because it had limited access to, those markets.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the situation would be different today if they could have used Bitcoin and then go to a stable coin or something.
Right. Or just convert it into a stable coin.
Directly, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that, the cryptocurrency, even if it's not being directly used as the ultimate savings device, it could still be a rails to harder currencies. So,
as you mentioned, you're sort of segmenting your answer into the slow friends who can't outrun the bear, which would be me in real life. But anyway, then do you think that Bitcoin could be or could affect central bank policy in developed, stable economies in any way?
It certainly depends on the path that this industry takes. While Bitcoin and just cryptocurrency, the asset class is still relatively small, I think the effect would really be minimal. But the point I do make in the article is that even in wealthier countries that have capital controls, the existence of relatively frictionless ways to avoid that definitely kind of impairs the state's monetary privilege a little bit. So it depends. I think China, you would say, is characterize it as a developed country. There's certainly a reason for their hostility to Bitcoin. I think what's the limit? Is it $50,000 worth of outflows a year? Yeah. Is the maximum?
I think so.
Yeah. I would love to see more data on usage of cryptocurrency on OTC markets in China. But I guess those brokers have a very small incentive to actually be public about it.
Yeah, honestly, what so many of my sources who go there say is that there's a very, very, very active OTC market, and it's sort of like the authorities kind of look the other way. That's sort of what people are saying. But anyway, all right, so we're going to discuss some of the other non-Bitcoin coins in a moment, as well as kind of wider global events. But first, a quick word from the sponsors who make this show possible.
Will the world follow France and advocate banning privacy coins? Will government-backed stablecoins become the new fiat? Are distributed and peer-to-peer exchanges just a flash in the pan? The answer is maybe. Virtual currencies can flourish and create a new, private, and more versatile economy. But that grand vision can't happen without keeping crypto clean. And that requires support of governments and accountability for bad actors. Privacy-enhanced compliance using cryptographic controls has the potential to preserve anonymity without compromising legitimate investigations. CipherTrace is working on this vision of the future. Sign up to stay up to date on the Privacy-Enhanced Compliance Initiative and receive authoritative crypto AML reports quarterly. www.ciphertrace.com/keepcryptoclean.
Back to my conversation with Nick Carter. So in your piece, you also take what I'm just going to broadly call altcoins to task. So are there any coins besides Bitcoin that you view as legitimate or promising?
Well, I think that's the question is, what constitutes legitimacy? So I think at this point you can't deny that, Ethereum has a really vibrant community and kind of organic groundswell of usage and development. Beyond that, I would say it's very sparse. And that's my, highly subjective opinion. But I mean, if you look at the data, very few chains aside from Bitcoin and Ethereum have any real usage whatsoever. But the problem I identified in the article is that there has been insufficient attention given to the legitimacy conferring factors for the long tail of altcoins. And so the emphasis has always been on technical innovation and, some of which were really marginal technical innovations and really insufficient attention to the things that I believe matter, which is like, how do you ensure that the developers can't abuse their privilege within the system? Are there checks and balances? Is the monetary policy credible, for instance? And oftentimes what we actually see in these systems is those credibility endowing factors are traded off to achieve, glamour metrics or technical thresholds. So for instance, not to pick on a particular coin, but in EOS, the transactions per second was prided at all costs, and the way that was achieved was by having a much smaller validator set. And then it emerged that the validators were maybe colluding or engaging in mutual voting in kind of a collusive way. And I think that poses a much greater long-term threat to the legitimacy of the network, which is not outweighed by the marginal kind of technical enhancement there. So this piece was partly me kind of trying to convince people that maybe their priorities needed to be recalibrated.
Well, one other thing I wanted to ask about was in your piece, you had this sentence, "The only cryptocurrencies worth creating are those that aim to be money." And yet, just now with your remarks with me, you did say that Ethereum, obviously had some traction and was quote unquote legitimate. I guess that was my phrasing. But I was just wondering, so do you still feel that that's the case? Because I don't think Ethereum's aiming to be money at all. So,
well, I would say Ethereum probably should contend and aim to be money. And I think we noticed a little bit of a recalibration where initially it was, computational gas, like the lubricant in the system. And then more recently, certain high profile Ethereans have been saying, well, actually, Ethereum itself is money. It's like a high powered collateral for, for instance, DeFi applications and so on. So my view, as someone who's very much outside of the Ethereum community, so maybe this is very much unsolicited advice, would be, yeah, absolutely, optimize for Ethereum as money, because the value giving thing here is whether people choose to hold the coin for a long period of time, have a long holding preference. And if it's just being used as working capital, the folks using the coin would try and minimize their exposure to it, only hold it for the duration of the period that they needed it for. So I guess I have a contrarian view on that.
Yeah, I actually think part of the new emphasis on Ethereum or Ether as money has to do with this transition to proof of stake, because I did see people saying there that, if the chain is going to be secure, then they do need to focus on the value of Ether. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Well,
I definitely agree.
Yeah. And one other cryptocurrency, or let's not call it cryptocurrency, we'll say digital currency, because I know some people will take me to task if I call it a cryptocurrency, that is in the news a lot and probably will affect the development of the whole space, has to do with Libra. So what is your take on kind of what is going to happen with that and how that will affect the development of the space?
Well, I think if Libra launches, it'll be a really critical development, maybe second only in importance behind the creation of Bitcoin in terms of the history of the industry. It's a big if, though. I don't have confidence that it will launch.
And why is that?
Well, it's just that, the team behind it was so, they seem to be very brash in terms of announcing their intentions to create a new monetary standard, a new unit of account. And I think the likely effect, if they went live in a lot of these developing countries with weaker local currencies, would be an outflow from those currencies to the harder currency, which would be Libra at that point. If it was chiefly backed by dollars, in theory, it would be much more stable, and it would, depreciate much more slowly than the local currencies. And this to me strikes me as extremely ambitious and idealistic. So, and also somewhat hostile to a lot of these developing central banks. If you have, hundreds of millions of their citizens given the option to store their savings in Libra, I think they would jump at the chance, which would make it more difficult to manage the local sovereign currency.
Wait, I'm sorry, you seem to say that the better route would have been for them to create a digital dollar, because wouldn't that have had the same effect?
Well, I think it would have been maybe better received in the U.S., because at that point, the impression would not have been that they were trying to replace the dollar as a monetary standard. And maybe that's, the history has not been written yet. We'll see what happens. But I think it would have been easier to sell Libra as advancing U.S. interests if they said, yeah, like this thing is going to be, a pegged dollar, and we're going to dollarize all these countries directly. I think in effect, that's what would happen anyway under their current configuration. It's just that, they're doing it under the guise of creating a completely new unit of account, whereas the dollar is right now the default unit of account.
Yeah. I wonder if part of it is because they view themselves, they are really a global company, and they didn't probably want to appear to be too U.S. centric. Well, anyway, so let's just assume that Libra does go through. So then what do you think the effect will be on Bitcoin and the crypto space?
Well, I don't know about Bitcoin. I've said that I think they're going to keep opening the Overton window of acceptability. Bitcoin is a non-corporate, non-state money. Libra would be a corporate non-state money. I think the most meaningful effect is that people begin to realize that money has been unbundled from the state, and it's not necessarily part of those services that the state is expected to provide for its citizens, which I think is good for all cryptocurrency generally, in as much as that we're just going through this process of becoming attenuated to, non-sovereign money systems. So I think that would be the most significant effect. I don't know if they'll be successful. I think ultimately they kind of political attack surface is really, really big. And if I were a developing central banker in a developing nation, I would try and shut them down right away.
Yeah, well, as we saw, France already is saying that, and they're not even a developing nation. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's all about positioning. I guess Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have totally flown under the radar somehow, despite people like me saying that they're hostile to the state. I guess maybe so a few people reached out to me and said I shouldn't have written this article because I was making our game plan known to politicians.
Okay, well, in case people didn't get the memo, these ideas have been out there for quite a long time. So it's not like what you were saying was brand new, which isn't to discount what you were saying. But
no, I agree. I agree.
Yeah. It's funny that they did that. Also because, it's not like Bitcoin has anybody at the helm being like, we're going to take down the state. But it is true that, of course, there are ways in which this could play out where it could be threatening someday.
And I mean, to be clear, I'm not advocating for anarchy. I just think that it's likely that the set of things we come to expect from the state ultimately ends up not including manage a monetary system. And I think we have plenty of evidence that they're not as good at that as they think they are, with the last decade being really compelling evidence of that.
Yeah, well, we will see how things play out. All right, Nick, well, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us today. To learn more about the topics we discussed, be sure to check out the links in the show notes of your podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Unconfirmed is produced by me, Laura Shin, with help from Fractal Recording, Anthony Yoon, Daniel Ness, Rich Streffolino, and Josh Durham. Thanks for listening.